The dust had barely settled on the road into Larkspur Hollow when Caleb Whitfield first saw her standing on the porch of the old Hargrove place, and for one long moment he forgot how to breathe. 7 years had passed since he'd last laid eyes on Rosalind Hale, 7 years since he'd watched her ride away from Missouri in her father's wagon with tears in her eyes and a promise on her lips that she never kept. And now here she stood in a faded blue dress, her dark hair pinned up loosely against the wind, looking at him as though he were a ghost risen from the plains. The toddler strapped to his back stirred and murmured against his shoulder, and Caleb reached back instinctively to steady the boy, the way he had done 1,000 times since his wife Mary had passed, and he saw Rosalind's eyes drop to the child and then lift again to his face, searching, questioning, remembering. "Caleb Whitfield," she said, and her voice cracked just slightly on his name, as though she'd said it in her sleep more times than she cared to admit. "I heard there was a new family taking the Miller property, but I never thought—" She stopped herself, pressed her lips together, and smoothed her skirt with hands that trembled just enough for him to notice. "Rosalind." He said her name like a man setting down something heavy he'd carried a long way. "I didn't know you were still out here. Last I heard you'd married and moved on to Cheyenne." "I did marry," she said quietly, and something in her face closed like a door easing shut. "Thomas passed 2 winters back. Fever took him same season, it took half the county's cattle. I came back here after to my aunt's place, since there was nothing left for me in Cheyenne but memories and debts." She glanced again at the boy on his back, and this time her eyes lingered, soft and searching. "And you? Is this your son?" "This is Jonas," Caleb said, reaching back to pat the boy's small boot. "He's mine and Mary's. She passed birthing him, going on 2 years now." He said it plainly, the way a man says a thing he has said so many times that the words have worn smooth like river stones, but something in Rosalind's face crumpled with a grief that seemed to belong as much to her own losses as to his, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the wind moving between them like something alive. It was Jonas who broke the silence, reaching one small fist toward Rosalind and babbling something that might have been a word or might have simply been the sound of a boy who liked the color of her dress. Rosalind laughed, a startled warm sound that seemed to surprise her as much as it did Caleb, and she stepped closer, letting the boy's fingers close around one of hers. "He's beautiful," she said. "He has Mary's eyes, I'd wager, though I never had the chance to meet her." "He does," Caleb said. "Everyone says so." They stood there a while longer in the golden light of that late afternoon, the windmill behind them creaking in the breeze, the mountains standing purple and distant beyond the fence line, and they talked the way 2 people talk when 7 years and a great deal of sorrow stand between them and the people they once were. Carefully, gently, circling the things that mattered most as though they might break if handled too roughly. Rosalind told him of her marriage to Thomas Hale, a good man but a quiet one, a rancher who had never quite filled the space in her heart that Caleb had left when her father moved the family west all those years ago, back when she and Caleb had been young and foolish and certain that nothing, not distance nor time nor the will of stern fathers, could keep them apart. She told him, too, of the letter she had written him after Thomas died, a letter she had torn up before sending because she could not bear to seem like a woman chasing after old love while her husband's grave was still fresh with turned earth. Caleb, for his part, told her of Mary, not with the guilt of a man comparing one woman to another, but with the plain honesty of a man who had loved his wife dearly and grieved her deeply, and who was trying, day by day, to raise a boy alone on a homestead that seemed to grow lonelier with each passing season. He told her about the nights Jonas cried and there was no one to help him walk the boy back to sleep, about the fields that needed 2 hands to work properly and how he'd had to hire help he could barely afford, about the way the house had gone quiet in a manner that made his chest ache every evening when the sun went down and there was no one to share the silence with. "You always did carry too much on your own shoulders," Rosalind said softly, and there was no judgment in it, only a tenderness that reminded him powerfully of the girl he had once loved beneath the cottonwoods along the Missouri River, the girl who used to tease him for his stubbornness and then kiss him anyway. That evening, Caleb rode back to his own homestead with Jonas asleep against his back. But his mind stayed behind on the porch of the Hargrove place, turning over every word Rosalind had said, every look that had passed between them. He told himself it was foolish to feel his heart lift so at seeing a woman he had not spoken to in 7 years, a woman who had married another man and buried him, a woman who was likely as wary of new heartbreak as he was. But foolish or not, the feeling stayed with him through supper and through the long evening of chores, and it stayed with him still when he lay down that night, listening to Jonas breathe softly in the small bed across the room. In the weeks that followed, their paths crossed again and again, first by circumstance and then, gradually, by design neither of them quite admitted to. Rosalind came to town on market days and always seemed to find Caleb there tending to his own business, and he began to notice the shape of her bonnet across the square before he consciously looked for it. She began bringing preserves to his homestead, claiming she'd made too many jars and couldn't possibly eat them all herself, and he began finding reasons to ride past the Hargrove place on his way to check his fences, though the fences in that direction had never needed much checking before. Jonas, for his part, took to Rosalind with the unguarded ease that only small children possess, reaching for her whenever she came near, laughing at faces she made, falling asleep in her arms one warm afternoon while the adults sat on the porch and talked of nothing and everything. It was on one such afternoon, with the boy sleeping soundly against her shoulder and the sun sliding low and orange behind the mountains, that Rosalind finally said what had been building in her heart for weeks. "Caleb," she said, and there was a seriousness in her voice that made him set down the cup of coffee he'd been holding. "I've thought long and hard about what I'm going to say, and I hope you'll forgive me for being so direct. But I've buried one husband already, and I've learned that life doesn't wait kindly for people who dance around what they mean." He waited, his heart beating hard against his ribs, watching her gather her courage the way he remembered her doing all those years ago before she'd first told him she loved him. "You and your boy need a home," she said. "A real home, with someone in it who loves you both, not just a house with walls and a roof. And I need the same thing, Caleb. I've had my fill of quiet houses and empty beds. I'm not asking because I'm lonely, though God knows I am that. I'm asking because I never stopped loving you, not really, not even when I married Thomas and tried my best to be a good wife to him. I think some part of me has been carrying you in my heart this whole time, the way you carry Jonas on your back, and I'm tired of pretending otherwise." For a long moment Caleb said nothing, and Rosalind's face began to fall, misreading his silence for hesitation or refusal, but he was only trying to find words large enough to hold what he was feeling. Finally he reached across the small distance between their chairs and took her free hand in his, careful not to disturb the sleeping child in her arms. "Rosalind Hale," he said, "I have loved exactly 2 women in my life. I loved Mary with everything I had, and I will grieve her until the day I die, and I won't apologize for that, not to you or to anyone. But before I ever loved Mary, I loved you, and these past weeks have taught me that kind of love doesn't die just because time and distance and other lives got tangled up in the middle of it. If you'll have a widower with a boy who needs a mother and a heart that's been broken and mended more than once, then yes, I want you and me and Jonas to be a family." She wept then, quietly, the kind of tears that come not from sorrow but from a burden finally being set down, and Jonas stirred at the sound but did not wake, and Caleb rose from his chair and knelt beside hers and held them both, woman and child, as the last of the daylight faded gold and then blue over the ranch. They were married that autumn in a small ceremony at the church in Larkspur Hollow, with Rosalind's aunt standing witness and half the county turning out for the supper afterward, since news travels fast in small towns and everyone loved a story of old sweethearts finding their way back to each other. Jonas, dressed in a little suit that Rosalind had sewn herself, toddled up the aisle ahead of his father and new mother, scattering rose petals that someone had given him to carry, though he seemed just as inclined to eat them as throw them, much to the amusement of the gathered guests. The first year of their marriage was not without its hardships. There were droughts that threatened the herd, and a fire that took the old barn one dry summer night, and the ordinary frictions that come when 2 people who have each known grief and independence must learn to build a life together rather than apart. But there was also laughter in that house now, laughter that echoed through rooms that had sat silent too long, and there was the sight of Jonas growing sturdy and bright-eyed under 2 parents' care instead of one exhausted father's, and there was, most of all, the quiet nightly comfort of 2 people who had waited a long time to find their way back to each other, lying beside one another and giving thanks for it. 2 years after their wedding, Rosalind gave birth to a daughter they named Eleanor, after Caleb's mother, and the house that had once seemed so achingly empty now rang with the voices of 2 children and the constant motion of a family in full bloom. Jonas, no longer strapped to his father's back but running free across the fields with his little sister trailing after him, grew up knowing both the mother who had given him life and the mother who had chosen to love him as her own, for Rosalind never let a day pass without speaking Mary's name to the boy with gentleness and respect, telling him stories of a woman he could not remember, but who had loved him fiercely in the short time she'd had with him. It was, Rosalind often said, the greatest gift she could give her husband and her stepson both. The assurance that love did not require forgetting, only room enough in the heart to hold more than one truth at a time. Years later, when Jonas was grown and had children of his own, he would tell the story of how his father and stepmother had found each other again after a lifetime apart, standing on a dusty porch beneath a windmill with mountains rising blue in the distance, and he would tell it the way his father had told it to him. Not as a tale of easy romance, but as a story of two broken hearts choosing, deliberately and bravely, to trust each other again after everything the world had taken from them. He would tell how his stepmother had said those simple words that changed all their lives, "You and your boy need a home," and how in saying them she had not just offered a house and a roof, but had offered herself, wholly and without reservation, to a man and a child who had needed exactly that kind of love to become whole again. And on the ranch that Caleb and Rosalind built together, which grew over the years into one of the finest spreads in the whole valley, there remained always a small wooden marker beneath a cottonwood tree near the house, where Mary was laid to rest, and every spring Rosalind planted wildflowers there with her own hands, and every year on the anniversary of Mary's passing, the whole family would walk out together. Caleb, Rosalind, Jonas, Eleanor, and in time grandchildren too, to remember the woman whose love had given them Jonas, and whose absence had, in its own sorrowful way, opened the door for a second chance at happiness that none of them had dared to hope for. It was, they all agreed, a strange and beautiful thing, how grief and joy could grow so entwined in a single family's history, how a single conversation on a dusty porch could turn two wounded lives into one whole and lasting home, and how love, when it is patient and true, has a way of finding its way back to those who have never truly stopped believing in it, no matter how many years or how many miles or how much sorrow stands in between.